Hello, friends. This is Dan Assisi, spending some time with you today, talking about lesson 37 of our Initiation into Spiritism, a wonderful book that we have been studying over the past weeks. And now we're reaching the final chapter. And I just want to say how grateful I am to be part of this journey with so many wonderful people. And if you haven't had a chance to look at all the other preceding lessons, don't be shy to head over to the United States Spiritist Federation website, where you can find all these reflections about this wonderful book by our friend Teresinha Oliveira that helps us ease our way into understanding Spiritism. So we are very grateful to be part of this team and to bring here forth our perspective about this very short chapters. And this is one of the great things about this book. The chapters are very short and easy to understand. So we welcome and invite you to go ahead and further your studies about Spiritism by diving into this book as well at your own time. But all that to say that I am very, very excited about the possibility of talking about this parable. This parable is called the parable of the laborers of the vineyard. Sometimes folks call it the workers of the last hour. And it's truly a incredibly deep story. And it's a story that we find in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 20, verses 1 through verse 16. And today we are going to talk a little bit about it and read it according to the New English Version translation. So, of course, you will be able to find this in different translations of the New Testament and the Bible, but we're using that translation today. And I am very thrilled about the possibility of talking about this parable, because I think it's really an incredible way of looking at the world and an invitation for us to consider changing the way we see things. And I'm also excited that we can share a couple of minutes together talking about the Spiritist lens to understanding this parable, because parables are beautiful stories that stick with us through the times and that let us unpack them as we move forward. So having the possibility to revisit that story and see the symbolism behind that story is one that it's really powerful for our own understanding of ourselves and the world around us. Now, of course, there's not just one interpretation of a parable. There's a lot more than that. And we want to be very clear with you that we are not saying that we are the ultimate authority on this. Nobody really is. And that's part of the fun of engaging with these parables, because we get to see and hear different perspectives from different people. And we begin to gather those little pieces of information and see if they resonate with our own lives. So I invite you to question our interpretation today. I invite you to dive deeper into finding your own meaning to this beautiful story. And it's a really beautiful story. But with any beautiful story, before we begin, it might make sense for us to recap what the story actually is about before we dive into what it could possibly mean to us. So I'm going to ask for your indulgence and for your patience, and we're going to read together some of that story. Actually, the whole story is just 16 little verses in the Gospel of Matthew, as we talked about. And the Gospel of Matthew is the first gospel that we see in the New Testament, along with the three other Gospels of Mark, Luke, and John. And Matthew has a lot to do with the Jewish tradition. So it's really interesting to see that story resonating from that perspective. But we can talk a little bit more about the context for this story too within the books in the New Testament later on if we have time. But without much delay, let's jump into the actual story. So bear with me as we read together here according to the New English Version translation. So here we go. Workers of the vineyard. As you might see here, I use color sometimes because it helps me understand things. So bear with me as we do this. For the kingdom of heaven, the story begins, is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard. And by the way, a denarius is a silver coin, the equivalent of a day's of work back in the day. So he agreed to pay them money for the day and sent them into his vineyard. About 9 in the morning, he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He told them, "You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. He went out again about noon and about 3 in the afternoon and did the same thing. About 5 in the afternoon, he went out again and found still others standing around. He asked them, "Why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing?" And they answered, "Because no one has hired us." So he said to them, "You also go and work in my vineyard." And when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last one hired and going on to the first." The workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came first, and each received a denarius. So when those came who were hired first, the ones that were hired earlier in the day, they expected to receive more. But each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. "These who were hired last worked only 1 hour," they said, "and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day." But he answered to one of them, "I am not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous?" So the last will be first, and the first will be last. Well, you might have heard the story before. You might have heard the last powerful sentence before at some point in time. But this is a really fascinating, I think. This is a really fascinating story, I think, because it's one that calls our attention. When we look at it from our perspective, we can understand. We can, right? Why is it that the workers who arrived first feel sometimes that they could have maybe been wronged, that maybe they should have received more than the people who received last? But this is where it gets really interesting, friends, and this is why I like this parable. As we start to look at the symbolism of the parable, it might offer us a different perspective and different takeaways. And I want to take some of the time with you today to go over a couple of them, because we will not be able to dive too deeply into this wonderful story. These are stories that may take a lifetime for us to unpack completely. But I hope that we will touch on some basic points that might serve as fodder for us to begin to understand the world around in spirituality. So I think the best way to start when it comes to understanding this parable is to really think about the fact that this is a story about spiritual growth. It starts with, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner that went to hire people." See, and I think this is very important, because I think that this was Jesus' way of framing the story from the beginning, saying, this is not about the world as it is. This is about the kingdom of heaven. That is, this is about the way, the vision, the aspiration that we have of what is most perfect. So while, yes, we are talking about things that are in the world, and they're about the world, and they're about our daily lives, Jesus doesn't have a lot of materials that he can use to really tell us about heaven and this enlightened way of being, because we haven't been there yet. So we don't know what it is. So he has to use tools that we're familiar with. And what we are familiar with is the material world. And so he uses tools and stories and symbolism of things in the material world to try to get us to think spiritually, because we are not there just yet. So a very important place to start here is for us to understand that everything that we are going to be talking about today is spiritual first, material second. And that's a game changer, because generally we do the opposite. We think that we are physical beings who have spirituality, who have a soul, who will live in the spiritual world later. But the opposite is actually true. We have come from the spiritual world, and Spiritism helps us understand that very well. And we reincarnate as many times as needed for us to fully realize that spiritual perspective. So this is a story about spiritual growth. And when we say that, we really mean that nothing is really what it seems. When we are talking about the spiritual realm and about spirituality in general, and we're using earthly terms because we don't have better terms, we have to understand that our conversation will be highly symbolic. And so we have to stretch a little bit of our creative minds to make sense about what it is. So when we really read about a landowner, workers and the foreman, the people in the story, they're really not about a land worker. They're not about workers. They're not about foremen. They are about us in different ways, right? Because the kingdom of heaven is like. So there's a role there. When we read about a vineyard and a marketplace, these are not just regular places like we would have vineyards and marketplace to be. They are symbolic too. And when we read about time and money, they're not concepts like we know here. They are deeper. They are going to ask us to spend some of our brain power really considering what they could be from a spiritual perspective. So as we level set for a story that we just read, we know that the story was about a landowner who has a vineyard, who goes out into a marketplace to find people to work in his vineyard. And we know then that because Jesus started a story with the kingdom of heaven is like, we know that the landowner, the owner of that vineyard, has to be God, because it's the kingdom of heaven. So when we read landowner, we are really thinking God. And when we think workers, we are really thinking us. And when we read foreman, we are really thinking about a manager who understands the landowner's needs and is able to manage the field in which we work. And in this particular case, we propose to you that the foreman is a highly evolved spirit who is in perfect harmony with the Creator, God. And that spirit is Jesus, our older brother, spiritual elder, who is here to show us the way. So when we're using these terms, we're really placing ourselves in the story. We can talk a little bit more about that as well. But it's important for us to kind of pay attention to that, because it's not a story about other people. It's a story about us, here and now. And when we talk about here and now, it's also important for us to look at the vineyard and the marketplace, because they're not just a vineyard and a marketplace. A vineyard is a place of production, is a place where vines and grapes grow, is a place where you work because you have to sow and you have to wait, you have to take care of the vineyard, and then eventually, when the time is right, you go out there and you collect the grapes to make wine. And the process of making wine is also one that takes time. You have to squash that grape, get the best out of that, let it ferment and wait so you can eventually have wine, which is another beautiful symbolism that we see in the New Testament in many different ways. So vineyard in many different ways, I feel like is our field of work. It's how we grow and perform great duties. And it's where we get to learn new skills and earn our living and make an impact in life. It's where we find our purpose and meaning. And the marketplace is also something similar. It's the place where we go to when we are ready to go, ready to work. The place we go to when we are looking for work, but we don't know exactly what that is. So it's also a beautiful symbolism because it tells a story of people who are waking up to the need to work spiritually and understand themselves and grow spiritually, but haven't yet found their place. Those are the people in the marketplace. That's us. Until we get called to work at the vineyard. And here's the interesting piece about this as well that I find fascinating. Time here is very, very curious. because we are going to hear mention of times in many different ways, at early in the morning, at 9 a.m., at noon, at 3 p.m., at 6 p.m. And it's important for us to understand that there's many different ways and many different layers of understanding that we can toss on top of the concept of time to understand that. We'll talk maybe a little bit more about that too, if we have the time, pun intended. But suffice to say that to understand our context and our symbolism, it's important for us to internalize that the day in that period of time was understood to start early in the morning, about 6 a.m., noon, 3 and 6 being the time where you would stop working and the day would be done. So the fact that we have these important milestones throughout the day is also telling in many ways. And so is the whole idea of money, the denarius and the reward or recompense. And so we talk about that. But I invite you to, whenever we are talking about these things, to think about them from a symbolic and a spiritual perspective. I know that it is somewhat difficult, and sometimes it feels so distant from what the story really is, but it's important for us to hold on to the concept that we first explored, that this is a story about spirituality and growth. So we are using earthly terms to kind of hint at things that are hard for us to still understand. But let's try anyways, and let's see what kind of lessons or focuses, or foci, I should say, we can kind of give to the story to see if we can understand it a little bit better and apply it in our daily lives. All right. The first lesson that I take from this wonderful parable is that God is constantly calling us to work. We see that because the landowner, it's going out to the market constantly. It goes out in the morning, it goes out at 9 o'clock, at noon, at 3, and at 5, which is just 1 hour before the day ends. So I think that there is a very implicit and explicit, actually, I should say, a message here for us that the Creator is constantly calling us to work. The Creator is constantly working. The entire universe is in constant evolution and progression. And that is something that we understand very well in Spiritism, because we understand that there's always this idea that we are working on improving ourselves to eventually get closer to God, but that the work always continues. And we have here in the story proof positive that there's always work going on. It's not about working for a day or two and then being done and enjoying perpetual retirement. This really is about bettering ourselves and understanding that there will be work to be done. And God is constantly calling us too. And I think that there is a certain beauty to this, because it's not that we only going to have one chance to work or make our way to the vineyard. God is constantly coming to us and giving us an opportunity to learn and grow, to work in this vineyard. And in many different ways, we begin as Spiritists to connect that idea to the idea of reincarnation. So every time God is coming and giving us a chance to work, it's almost like we are starting a new life. And with many reincarnations over time, we progress. And so God may call us in many different times, not only of one lifetime, but of many lifetimes. And I think that's also our second point that we want to make here, is that God is always working and always creating and always doing more things and calling us to work. And the flip side of this, or the companion side of this, I should say, is that for us individuals, spiritual spirits in evolution, we are constantly getting called at different times. And this is where the concept of time also comes in and gives us a plethora of understanding. Because when we say we're constantly being called at different times, we are saying that time can be understood in different ways. So in one lifetime, we are getting many different opportunities to evolve. Maybe we're getting it when we're young. Maybe we're getting a little tap on the shoulder through a challenge in our lives when we are in our early years, in our 20s. Maybe we are getting that tap on the shoulder again and an invitation to work on ourselves and grow when we're getting a little bit older. And certainly, a lot of us start to think about spirituality and growth when we are about to enter our more elderly, blah, 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 blah. Let's try this again. Where we are about to enter our more elderly phase of life. Because then, as death approaches, we become to consider spirituality a little bit more. So, we are like those people in that marketplace that are getting the call for action, for understanding, and for growth. And we get that in many different times in one lifetime, but we also get that in many lifetimes. So we could read the 9 o'clock, the noon, the 3 o'clock, not only as times of the day, but phases of our lives, or even phases of our spiritual evolution, where we are growing from reincarnation to reincarnation. And the more we evolve, the more the request for us to work comes through. So there's a lot of different ways that we can look at this, but our time is short. And I want to leave it to you to ponder about the possibilities of what time could mean in this parable. How do you see that timing affecting your life and your understanding? Because spiritual growth does happen in different times. And what I really like on the timepiece, and this is where I will move on quickly to something else, is that people are called at different times. Some are called at 9 and some are called at noon. Not everybody will awaken to spirituality and to the beauties of understanding life after life at the same time. And that's a lesson that we see constantly in many other stories of the New Testament and that are interesting to ponder. We are called at times that are different to those around us. And that sometimes is hard because we wish we could all move at the same pace, but we all work in different ways and go at different speeds. So do not worry about what time you get called. Worry more about what are you going to be doing when that call to work comes. Because remember that many of those workers who were in the marketplace, they were waiting for work. The landowner even asked them, so what have you been doing? Have you been idling? Why are you here in the marketplace? And none of them answer, oh, because we were having fun or doing nothing. They just said, because nobody hired us. That is to say, they were willing to work, but they didn't find a way to do it. And then the landowner says, then come to my vineyard and I'll pay you what is right. So if you are ready and you put yourself in a position to be able and willing to work, the work will show up, even if you have to wait a little bit. So it's not about when you start, but how you finish. So do not worry if you find yourself in a position in your life where you feel like you're behind, because that is not the case spiritually. You are where you need to be able to take the next step in your evolutionary process or journey, whether that be for a lifetime or for many lifetimes ahead. And that's how we begin to transfer a little bit, or to transform, I should say, a little bit our perspective when we begin to think of ourselves not just as a creature of one lifetime, but as an immortal spirit that lives many lifetimes. When we put those spiritual goggles on and we see life from a spiritual perspective, we begin to change the way we evaluate the things that are in front of us. It's not just about what's right in front of us, but it's about the long term. It's about us, the spiritual being. It's not just about making sure that we are rich and famous today at any cost, stepping on anybody. It's about making the right choices so that we will be happy tomorrow and in the lives after that, because our conscience will be in peace with the fact that we have not hurt anybody and we have not acted in ways that are selfish or damaging to other people. But before I go more on that tangent, let's also bring a little bit joy in our lives and talk about the fact that in this parable, there is also a promise of justice for all of us. When the landowner goes to the marketplace and says, come to my vineyard because you have been waiting for work and I will pay you whatever is right, there is a commitment there by the creator of all things, which we call God, but you can use any other name, that there is justice for everybody. There is a right piece, and that you will not be wronged in the long term. And that's really beautiful, because sometimes if we just look at our lives the way we are right now, it feels like the world is not just. We look at things, we look at people cheating each other and getting ahead, and we sometimes say, where's the justice in that? We feel like maybe there isn't a God, but that's not the case. That only looks like that because we are seeing very tiny little moments of time of the Spirit. But be assured that all our actions have consequences. So if we do something to wrong somebody today, our conscience will hurt us so much that we'll be forced to move ourselves into a place of restitution where we make up for that action. What might happen is that we might not see that desire and need to rest, to recompense those who have harmed in one lifetime. So when we're only looking at one lifetime, it's almost like we're only watching a frame out of a whole movie. We only see a scene and we don't see the whole movie. But when we do see the whole movie, we begin to understand that there's always justice. And I'm reminded of a beautiful quote by Martin Luther King that says that the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I think it's a beautiful way of thinking about this, that things might feel like they're taking a long time to right themselves, but they will always right themselves because there is justice in the universe. So if you're going through a tough moment right now and you're feeling like you have been wrong, that the world is not just, rest assured that the creator of all things is promising the right reward for all of us. And that is very important to kind of let our hearts settle a little bit and we don't feel like the world is coming undone. That's a lot there. What else is there? Well, let's talk about some of the big items here that are very clear. And I think this is a big one. The reward is the same for everyone in the story. And this is the part that sometimes it's really hard to deal with, really hard to understand, because when we read it, it feels like, well, they have been there for longer, so maybe they should get more money. And it's a natural piece because we are thinking with our material mindset. But you see, even in modern terms, in the modern material world, we have been having discussions about productivity. And we have beginning to make leaps in this area by saying, it's not about how many hours you work on something. It's about how effective you are at that thing. Couldn't it be possible that somebody does work that is of good quality, and that work that is done in 1 hour of their time is actually the same as the work that somebody else was doing for 5 hours? Could it be that a master painter can paint a picture that is lifelike in a day, and that would take us 3 months to do the same thing or even worse? So Jesus here, as he tells us the story, he begins to tell us that we should question our idea of reward and position and status. It's not because we have been there for the longest that we are better than anybody else. And that is really a game-changing proposition, because it's not about, like we said, status quo or seniority. It's not whether you got there first. It's about what you are doing. In that particular story, for instance, we don't see the laborers, the workers, complaining about the work that the newcomers had done. We just see them complaining about the fact that they got paid the same. You see here, this is an important distinction, because there is no mention of they didn't work as hard or they didn't do good quality work. The complaint was, we have been here longer, working hard. And that is a fascinating perspective for us to begin to understand, because if you think about it, and we begin to think about the concept of reincarnation again that Spiritism brings to us, it may offer us a different way of interpreting this parable. Because what if that newcomer that came at the last minute already had some knowledge of farming and was already really good at the vineyard because he had worked at vineyards before in this life or even in previous lifetimes. Sometimes, for instance, we see prodigies, children that know how to play Beethoven, Mozart at 4 years of age without seeming like they have never learned that. Well, obviously they learned that at some point in time. They might just not have learned in this lifetime, but they learned it before. So a lot of our talents and abilities seem like they were God-given in the sense that they just appeared out of nowhere and they were a gift from God. Yes, they were a gift from God, but they were a gift from God through our own effort during many different lifetimes that are behind. And there is a beautiful sentence by Allan Kardec, the codifier of Spiritism, that tells us this, that every cause has an effect. And that if we cannot see the cause of an effect in this lifetime, then we should look in previous lifetimes because every cause has an effect. So if we don't see the cause now, it has to take place before. So what if, in that particular point, Jesus is raising an important topic for us to understand that we have abilities, talents, aptitudes, and qualities that are different from each other. And that just because we put the same amount of time on certain things doesn't mean that we're going to be as able as somebody else. And that is okay because we're all at different levels of understanding. And wouldn't it also make sense, for instance, to think that those who came in last were highly motivated to get the job done because they hadn't worked the whole day and they wanted to prove their point or prove their worth. And they worked extremely hard when others did not. So it's an invitation, I think. And this is, I think, the big perspective here in this parable is for us to stop thinking about hierarchy and status. It's not about the fact that we've been here before others that makes us better. It's how much we produce. And the concept of justice and reward is an interesting one too, right? Because I think key to this whole story is this concept of success and justice. Because at the end of the day, weren't those workers promised that they were going to receive 1 denarius? Didn't they get what they were promised? So why are they complaining? And let's be frank here. They are complaining because they realized that other people got the same thing they did, and they felt wrong for that. That is to say, for them, the concept of justice and reward is to have more than other people. And that is a soul-searching moment for all of us. Is our concept of success and happiness also predicated on the fact that we must have more than other people to be happy? Or should we internalize that having enough to having what we were promised or need is good enough? Because for as long as we use others as the measure of our success, having more than somebody, being more than somebody, being stronger than somebody, we are not yet truly effective workers of the vineyard. We will still receive, of course, recompense. But these stories, spiritual stories, are about mindset changes. And I think that this is the biggest takeaway from the parable of the workers of the vineyard, or the workers of the last hour, or the laborers of the vineyard, whichever name you want to give to this story. It's an invitation for us to challenge ourselves as to what constitutes success in our lifetimes, physical or spiritual. Because somehow, sometimes, I feel like we have bought into this presupposition that success is to have a lot of money, to have a great car or house, or at the very least, have more than my neighbor. But what if what your neighbor has does not matter? What if there was nobody around you? Then How do you know you're happy? How could you live with yourself? We keep looking to the outside world, asking the outside world to tell us that we are okay, to tell us how to behave, to give us an indication of how we can solve our problems. But nothing that comes from the outside world will truly address our needs and our innermost desires. Because the outside world, things, other people, cannot make us feel happy. We are the creators of our own happiness. We are the ones that have to take the responsibility to ourselves and understand that we are the ones who craft our future, our actions, our choices, and by consequence, our own happiness. Because you see, having is not a requirement for being happy. We see many things that have nothing and are extremely happy. And so, it's not about competition with others. It's about being gracious and grateful for what we have. And shouldn't we be happy about what we receive, and if others receive the same? Wouldn't that make us happy if we are truly in a place where we care about others and are zen about ourselves, are really centered and balanced? Why would what others get affect us in any way? We should actually be happy for the success of those around us. If we have enough, why does it matter if other people are getting enough too? And that is a really difficult piece for us to make sense in a world that tells us that we have to have more than other people. But we're not in competition with other people because we're all workers in the vineyard. And so that story, like any other story in the New Testament, is about mindset change. And he begs the difficult question: what will we do from here on? And that's why I think Spiritism is such a powerful tool, because it reminds us on a daily basis that we are immortal spirits who are temporarily engaged in this physical body, and that when we leave this physical body, we will eventually go back to the spiritual world and come back into another physical body until we learn the lesson to value ourselves spiritually more than our physical bodies. So now that we are being reminded constantly, because we begin to understand reincarnation, because we understand mediumship, and we're able to talk with the spirits and read book written by the spirits and see spirits in some cases for those of us who are mediums, how can we deny that the spiritual is there? That, I think, is the great mindset that we must do to begin to apply spirituality in our lives more than the materialistic approach that we use most of the time. After all, isn't that the message that our older brother, the Christ, has come to give us? When we look at his life, for instance, we see not a life of suffering, but a life of happiness and education. Because if there's one message that I take away from his passage here on earth, as I begin to look at Jesus anew, and that's why I use this different picture that a lot of people sometimes don't use, because I want to challenge our preconceived notions of what Jesus stands for. I see a new beginning, because Jesus came to tell us that even after he lost his physical body, even after he was killed, he came back to show us that we live on. And so that's the message that we must hold on to, that we will outlive this physical body, and that those who we love will too. And that is a reassuring message, because as we work all in the vineyard, we will begin to understand that there is no loss. Nobody loses. We don't lose people when they die. They don't lose us. Our love continues whether we are incarnate or discarnate. Our connections are there. Our work continues. And we all are going to arrive at that ultimate goal and that ultimate reward, that is happiness. That's an invitation for us to change the perspective on how we operate and what we do. And I think in many different ways, that's what this parable brings to us. This constant calling for us to heed the call of going to the vineyard, that is, working on ourselves spiritually, And I hope that more and more you can spend some time yourself digging into these beautiful texts, these New Testament stories, Spiritist books, psychographies are just a good book that uplifts you and makes you think about your role in the world and to recognize that who you are is far more than meets the eyes. And that's the certainty that we begin to feel when we read these stories about Jesus and begin to understand Jesus in a different way, not in the way that we have been told we should look at Jesus, but in a way that is liberating because Jesus has come as a game changer to show us that the spirit is more important than the physical body, and that should be our focus at all times. So I hope that you have a chance to engage with this parable on your own, with the other chapters of this wonderful book on your own, with other videos that were produced, so you can have some sparking to kind of kickstart some of your own ideas, that maybe you can go and find a group of like-minded people to discuss these important matters, especially in times like these, where we're all struggling to make sense of the world around us in the middle of war, pandemics, economic crisis, hate, discrimination. It seems like there is a lot. But we just all need to keep working because everything is going to be okay. So thank you. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Thank you for taking the time to work on yourself, and let us know. Let us know what you think and what you find interesting. Look for a Spiritist group near you to have the conversation. If there isn't one, begin one. There are tons of wonderful Spiritist books that will help you keep your focus on the spiritual for many moments in your day. Just go forth and answer that call to go work in the vineyard of your own heart, of your own soul. And with that, I thank you for your time with us today. And we'll check in to see if we have time for a couple of questions before we adjourn. Oh, there are a couple of questions. So this is a great question. This is a question is the story about communism? I get that a lot when we talk about this. Is this really a story about everybody gets the same no matter what? I'm going to say no, it's not. Because remember when we talked about this story being spiritual? This story is not about an economic system. This story is about spiritual individual growth, like we said before. This is about us understanding what makes us happy. And what makes us happy does not necessarily mean that others have to feel less privileged than we are. Because for as long as we're putting other people down to feel better about ourselves, then we haven't quite gotten it, have we? So this is not about an economic system. This is not about a reward system. This is not about an economic model. This is about us coming to terms with ourselves about how do we judge what happiness is and what self-satisfaction and fulfillment are. So I know that we tend to think about this story, in physical terms, because it's all about marketplaces and payment, and that really hits home for us, right? But remember how the story started? The story started with Jesus saying, "For the kingdom of heaven is like." And heaven is not like earth. It will be a downgrade, right? So we need to change that perspective. We need to make earth more like heaven. So we need to do an upgrade, and we need to think more individually speaking into our own satisfaction than economic terms. So one way of looking at it is it's not about communism. This is about how we individually, each one of us, settles with our own hearts and what makes us feel satisfied with what we have. And also being happy for others, that others also have enough in their own plate, in their own life, that others also find happiness. It's about us changing ourselves and in the process, helping others along the way. I hope that makes sense. All right. Oh, and there's another one popping in here. And we have just a couple of more minutes, so we try to go quickly. So who are we in this story? And that's a question that I like to ask quite a bit, because every story in the New Testament has all of us as protagonists in one way or another. We can be many different people here, but I think that it makes sense for us to say that the role that we play more often here is the worker. But what kind of worker are we? Are we the worker that arrived early in the morning? Are we the worker that came at 9 o'clock, at noon, at 3 o'clock, or 6? At the end of the day, we sort of are all of these workers. Because if we believe in reincarnation, we know that we were here early on and we were called, and we were here at 9 o'clock and we were called, and we were here at 3 o'clock and we were called, and we were here at 5 o'clock and we were called. The more important question is, what did we do with that calling? Did we answer that call? Did we work on ourselves? And so it's not that there is a better or worse worker, because at the end of the day, the reward is the same. The question is, how do we make use of the opportunities that we get in the story? So there isn't a better or worse one. We're all of those. We have been in many different situations in many different lifetimes. It's a matter of who do we want to be, not who we were. And so don't let yourself be weighed down by the fact that sometimes you may not have accomplished everything that you wanted in the past, or that maybe you did not make a great use of the situations that you were in and the opportunities that you were given. Yes, to all this, maybe that is true, but leave that aside for a second and be like that worker that came at the last hour and worked his or her tushy off to get things done. Be that person. Make use of that opportunity to receive your fair reward at the end of the day, which ultimately is what? Self-fulfillment and happiness. So let's look forward. Let's be that worker, the worker that's working right now. All right. I know I tend to babble quite a bit. So let's see if there's one more, and then we can kind of wrap things up, depending on how our time is. How do we change our mindset to a more spiritual one? I think that's the trick, isn't it? I don't know about you guys, but I think that Spiritism gives us that perspective. It reminds us every day that we can change our perspective through the practice and awareness of things. And sometimes I even joke and say that most of the days I spend more time brushing my teeth than thinking about myself as an immortal spirit. So let's make time to remember and remind ourselves that we're spiritual beings. Connect with spirituality, read a good book, talk to other people about these things, and it will come more easily, and we'll begin to think and make choices with the spirit in mind as opposed with the material body in mind. So it's about practice. It's about flexing your spiritual muscles. And so with that, I want to thank you for being here with us today. I invite you, of course, to be in touch. If you want to connect with us in social media, please do that. I'm very creative. I have all the social media handles are the same. But more importantly, next week in the next module, we are going to have a question and answer with some of our speakers here, many different things. So there will be smart people with which you can engage. So check those modules out and have a chance to bring your own questions to the forefront so that you can continue your work in the vineyard. I hope that makes sense to you. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope that it motivates you to continue your studies. Thank you for being with us today. God bless you, and may you continue to work for as long and as hard as you can in the vineyard of your own self-improvement.